This is the moment the Middle East stopped being a regional conflict and became something the entire world should fear. As of 3:22 in the morning, Thursday, April 17th, 2025, Israeli precision missiles struck a facility inside Iranian territory that was not Iranian. The building that burned to the ground overnight housed Russian technicians, Russian communications equipment, Russian logistics infrastructure built quietly over the last 3 years to move goods, weapons, and money through Iran and around Western sanctions. It was Russia's hidden hand inside Iran, and Israel just cut it off. If you looked at the satellite imagery released this morning, you would see a perfectly rectangular black scar where a warehouse complex used to be. No surrounding damage, no collateral chaos, a surgical hit. Clean, deliberate, and aimed at something that Russia considered untouchable. Vladimir Putin has issued a warning in response. Not a tweet, not a press briefing. A formal, recorded, state-level warning delivered through channels that Western media outlets decided, remarkably, not to report. In this analysis, we are going to tell you exactly what that warning said, why it matters more than anything else happening in this war right now, and what it means for every country connected to Russian energy, Russian weapons, or Russian patience. Israel is not just fighting Iran anymore. It has just declared, whether it meant to or not, a conflict with Moscow. 3 years ago, Russia made a quiet decision that nobody in the Western press thought was worth covering. Facing unprecedented sanctions after the Ukraine invasion, Moscow began building an alternative economic spine through Iran. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use Iranian soil, Iranian ports, and Iranian infrastructure to keep Russian trade alive. Build warehouses, station Russian staff, move grain south and weapons technology north. Keep it below the radar of American satellites by keeping it technically inside a country that the US was already sanctioning anyway. 2 sanctioned nations, 1 shared corridor, 0 Western interference. It was supposed to generate an estimated $8 billion in annual bilateral trade by 2026. It was supposed to be the economic lifeline that made Western pressure on Russia permanently ineffective. Moscow invested hundreds of millions building these facilities, including the compound that burned this morning. Netanyahu knew exactly what that compound was. Israeli intelligence, which operates some of the most sophisticated human networks in the world, had been watching it for over a year. The deliberate choice was made not to strike it for months because striking a Russian facility, even one inside Iran, is not the same as striking an Iranian facility. The consequences are categorically different. The gamble Netanyahu made this week was that Russia was too distracted by Ukraine, too economically pressured, and too diplomatically isolated to respond meaningfully. He assumed Russia would absorb the blow quietly. He assumed wrong, and the warning that came back from Moscow proves it. At 3:22 a.m. Tehran time, 4 Israeli air-launched missiles crossed into Iranian airspace from the west and struck the compound in the industrial zone outside Avaz in Khuzestan province. The first missile hit the main communications hub. For 30 seconds, there was nothing. No explosion sound reached the nearest residential area. That is how precise the strike was. Then, the secondary ignition hit, and witnesses 12 kilometers away reported seeing a column of fire rise above the tree line that lasted nearly 8 minutes. Pause. But the strike itself was only half the story. While the compound was burning, Russian emergency diplomatic cables were moving simultaneously through 3 separate channels. Moscow to Tehran, Moscow to Beijing, and Moscow to the UN Secretariat in New York. According to 2 diplomatic sources with knowledge of the communications, all 3 messages carried the same core statement. Russia considers this strike an attack on Russian sovereign assets and will respond accordingly. And while those cables were moving, something was happening in global energy markets that the financial press almost entirely missed. Russian natural gas futures jumped 6.3% within 2 hours of the strike becoming public. Oil traders began pricing in what one senior London analyst described as the possibility that Russia withdraws cooperation from the Iranian energy corridor entirely, which would remove roughly 1.4 million barrels per day of effective capacity from global supply chains. The market does not wait for diplomatic language. It priced the danger immediately. By 7 a.m. Moscow time, the Russian Foreign Ministry had gone on record. What they said was not a condemnation. It was not a protest. It was a warning, calm, specific, and chilling in its precision. Russia stated that any further strikes on Russian-linked infrastructure, regardless of the country in which that infrastructure is located, would trigger a proportional and permanent restructuring of Russia's regional posture. That phrase, permanent restructuring, is not diplomatic boilerplate. Inside foreign policy circles, that phrase means one thing: retaliation that does not reverse. According to sources briefed on Kremlin internal communications, a restricted meeting took place in Moscow at 5 a.m. local time on April 17th, within 90 minutes of the strike. The room included Putin, his National Security Council, and the director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. One participant, speaking on condition of anonymity to a European intelligence outlet, described the atmosphere as controlled fury. Putin reportedly said very little for the first 20 minutes. He listened. Then he said, "They have confused our patience with our weakness. We will correct that understanding." The decisions made in that room were not military. They were economic and strategic, and in many ways more dangerous. Russia would not fire missiles. Russia would do something worse. It would begin systematically closing every door it had previously left open for Israel. Syrian airspace permissions that Russia had quietly extended to Israeli aircraft for years would be reviewed. Arms cooperation discussions with Hezbollah, which Russia had kept at arm's length, would be reopened. And the mutual defense framework that Iran had rejected 2 years ago would be placed back on the table, this time with new urgency on both sides. Israel struck a building. Russia decided to redraw a map. Why did Israel do this now? Follow the pressure, not the strategy. Israel is running out of clean targets inside Iran. The nuclear facilities are too dangerous to strike without American backing it does not currently have. The missile production sites are too dispersed. But a Russian logistics compound, quiet, off the books, technically civilian, offered a way to hurt Iran's supply chain without crossing the nuclear threshold. From a narrow tactical view, the logic made sense. But the power shift this creates is historic. Before April 17th, Russia was a background actor in this war, present, influential, but technically uninvolved. After April 17th, Russia has standing. It has grievance. It has a public record of being attacked. That changes everything about what Russia is now permitted to do in response, morally, diplomatically, and legally. The 2018 Caspian Convention and multiple bilateral infrastructure protection agreements give Russia a legitimate legal argument that its assets were violated. That argument does not require a military response to be devastating. It requires only that Russia begins treating Israel the way it treats Ukraine, as an active adversary rather than a tolerated nuisance. When that reclassification happens formally, Israel loses every quiet accommodation Moscow had previously extended. Netanyahu cannot undo this. The strike is in the record. Russia's response is now a matter of when, not if. Here is what happens next if Russia follows through on even half of what was decided in that 5 a.m. meeting. If Russia closes Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, Israel loses its primary strike corridor into Iran and Lebanon. If that corridor closes, Iran's weapons transfers to Hezbollah become significantly harder to intercept. If those transfers accelerate, northern Israel faces a missile threat it cannot neutralize with Iron Dome alone. An Iron Dome costs $100,000 per interception, while the incoming rockets cost $500 each. That math destroys Israel's military budget within months. China is calculating this in real time. Beijing has spent 5 years waiting for a moment when Russian-Israeli tensions would create a vacuum in Middle Eastern diplomacy. That moment is now. Every Gulf state is watching Washington's silence and reading it correctly as an American unwillingness to stand fully behind Israeli escalation at this scale. Inside Israel, the split is growing. Senior figures in the security establishment are calling the Avaz strike reckless. Former intelligence chiefs are going on record. The coalition partners who support Netanyahu's war strategy are now asking questions they were not asking 72 hours ago. A divided Israeli government cannot sustain a multi-front war, and Netanyahu, by all accounts from people inside his circle, knows it. He is sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night. He is canceling briefings. He is asking the same question repeatedly to different staff members, hoping for a different answer. Will Washington back us if Russia moves? No one in the room is saying yes. The black scar in the satellite image outside Avaz is not just a destroyed building. It is the place where Israel's strategy of unlimited escalation met its first real wall. A wall built not of Iranian resistance, but of Russian consequence. Netanyahu wanted to send a message to Tehran. What he actually sent was a message to Moscow. And Moscow wrote back in language that no Western outlet bothered to translate for you. You can strike Iranian proxies and call it containment. You cannot strike Russian assets and call it anything except what it is, a provocation against the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet by a country that holds fewer than a third as many warheads. So where does this stand today? Russia is repositioning. Iran is being handed the alliance it previously refused. Hezbollah is waiting on a phone call from Moscow, and Israel is standing in the middle of a ring it drew around itself, wondering why the walls are getting closer. Expect Russia's first visible move within the next 10 to 21 days. It will not be a missile strike. It will be an announcement, a military cooperation agreement, an airspace decision, or an arms package that permanently shifts the balance of this war in ways that 1,000 Israeli drones cannot undo. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The moment Russia makes its move, we will be here to break it down in real time. This story is not over. It is just beginning, and the people who understand it first will be the ones least surprised by what comes next. Watch closely. The warning has been issued. The clock is running.